Hi, welcome to this video where I'm going to put together a 4-tier shelf for my daughter. She needs some space in her room in the corner for some books and other things, so I found this design online and thought I'd give it a go. Now, the width of each shelf is going to be a little bit wider than what you would find from a standard board at your home center. So I'm going to have two boards here, one that's 12 inches wide, one that's 8 inches wide. I'm going to join them together to get that 20 inches that I need. You could go with plywood here. I preferred to use boards in this case, so I'm going to end up joining these together to get the size of the shelves that I want. Now, before I glue these together, I'm actually going to cut these down a little bit. My workspace is the patio. I don't have a ton of room, so this is just going to make my life a little easier to work with two sets of shorter boards than the two 8-foot boards you saw before. Now, in order to join the boards together the long way, I'm actually going to take my straight edge here and I'm going to cut down a nice smooth straight edge, and that's just going to help me get a nicer seam when I ultimately join these two together. So you can see now when I lay these two together, we've got a nice seam, and I'm just going to do the same thing with the other set. Now, in order to join them, I only own so many clamps. You see a lot of woodworking videos where they just own a ton of clamps. I don't have that many clamps. And just as importantly, I'm working outside, so time is sort of the essence. I don't want to set all this up and then wait a whole day for the glue to dry. So I've got those pocket hole screws that I just displayed before. And I'm going to use these as sort of an extra set of permanent clamps. So I'm still going to glue these together, but I'm going to take my pocket hole jig. I'm just going to put about 6 pocket holes in here. And what these are going to do is these are going to secure the boards together with the glue. And it's going to allow me to not have to wait as long before I can start working on the wood at the next step. So just going to use my pocket hole jig, drill the screws in here. And once I've drilled in all these holes, I'm going to do the same thing with the other set of boards to get my shelves. And then we're going to glue these together and put the screws in. And again, I will have clamps, but these are going to act like another set of clamps for me as well. So I've glued these boards up. I've got the clamps holding them together, and I'm going to go ahead and put these pocket hole screws in. Again, an extra set of clamps. It's going to let me work with the wood much sooner than if I was only using glue. Now, while I am waiting for that glue to dry at least a little bit, I'm going to come back to, well, same station, new tool, to my miter saw, and I'm going to cut out the support pieces for the shelf. Now, in this case, I've already cut out the 6-inch support pieces. You can see them here. These are going to be a little bit more prominently displayed on the sides. But after I've cut these, I'm going to come back and now cut out the 4-inch support pieces that are going to be in the back corner of the shelf, a little less visible. But I'm going to use the same stop block that I used for my 6-inch pieces so that every piece will be the exact same length. Now, in the meantime, cut to when the glue has dried. And I can take the clamps off, and the screws are still helping me out here. But to smooth out that seam before I sand this all down, I like to use a hand planer. So I'm going to plane down that seam on both boards here, ultimately sand it down, and then cut it down to the size of my shelves. So here's the final set of boards. I've got my 4-inch support pieces that we saw before. I also have my 6-inch support pieces that we saw before, but now I also have my shelf pieces as well that have been cut down. And the next step with these is going to be to cut out this corner to get that kind of curved L shape that we see in the plans. So I'm going to do this 4 times. We'll walk through one of these so you can see kind of how I did it. Before I get there though, one word of caution with pocket screws is if you aren't as careful, like I was, or was not, you'll see that you can sometimes cut through pieces where the screws are. It might be hard to see. So
enhance.
There we go. So you can see here that my circular saw actually went through the edge of a screw and has left me with a pretty ugly hole at the edge of one of my boards here. There's no real Control Z for this, so we'll have to figure out how to either cut it off or fill it in as we go. Now, to get the perfect curve in the middle of the board, I'm going to start with my hole saw drill bit because, well, it's a perfect circle and it's going to be harder to screw that up. I'm still going to come back with my jigsaw to cut straight lines with the help of a speed square and cut some of these outside curves. But I think I'm going to pay the most attention when I'm looking at this thing at the inner curves, so we're going to use a circle tool for that. Now I'm also going to use some painter's tape here, and that's going to help with the crosscut just to avoid any tear out on the underside of the board. And now once I've got that piece cut out, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually use my oscillating tool with the sander attachment. It's just a little bit smaller and easier to get in there than my random orbit sander. So just going to do all of this 4 times to get these 4 pieces. I'm going to line them up here just to make sure everything's looking pretty good. 2 thumbs up, looks good. Now, one thing I forgot to put in the plan, but I'm going to do here is the bottom shelf. I want to account for any baseboard that's in the corner of my daughter's room. So what I'm actually going to do is take 3/4 inch off those back edges so that this can go up nicely against the wall of the room and account for that baseboard there at the bottom. And again, just going to use some painter's tape here to help with any potential tear out on the underside. Now, one thing I wanted to try and do is joining for this project is use dowels. I haven't done it before, and what I did is I just bought, looks like a 2 or 3 foot rod, and I'm just going to cut down all these little dowel pieces. Not worried too much about how long they are, just going to estimate for all of them. And then once I'm done cutting these out, I'm just going to smooth out the edges so they go in nice and neat. I'm just going to do this by putting the dowels in my drill and running that up against the sander. Gonna do this a whole bunch of times and ultimately end up with the saddest looking piece of sandpaper I've ever seen at the end. He's so tired. Now, what I do have to do is figure out how to line up the holes when I'm using the dowels between the shelf pieces and the boards. I tried this method initially with some painter's tape that allows you to transfer the marks from the board to the support piece. Ultimately, it just kind of got really annoying dealing with all the painter's tape. So I abandoned this one after like 1 use. Instead, I measured everything out. And now what you can see is I have drilled out all the holes on the shelves, underside and top side, as well as in the support pieces, and fit the dowels in to make sure everything was fitting. Now, what I'm also going to do is sand everything down now before I assemble it so that I don't have to worry about getting into any corners later. I've got these little Craig puck pieces that allow me to set my wood on them without getting dinged up. And I've actually already gone over everything with a 180 grit. I'm going to come back and now use a 220 grit just to do a final sand on all these pieces so that they are ready to be stained if I don't need to sand them again later. So this is one board, but imagine me sanding and sanding and sanding and sanding, and he sanded late into the evening. Lots of sanding. So much sanding. You get the idea. Now, one quick tip. I did mark up the board so I knew which support pieces went to which shelf. Dry fit looks good. We're going to come back and now put the whole thing together with the glue. here it is, the finished glued product. Now we just need to go over it and find out where I messed up. And to help with that, we have a fun product called wood filler. Stainable quality. So anywhere where I didn't quite get the gaps filled in, I'll use that. And then what I've also done is in the places where I did still use pocket screws, these are less visible, but I've got these wooden plugs here where I'm going to plug in the hole so you can't see the screws. All I have to do now is glue those plugs in, sand them down, and they'll feel super smooth, and they really won't be all that noticeable because, again, these are on the pieces that are facing into the shelf. And now for any other pieces that didn't line up perfectly, I'm going to come back and I'm going to sand down all the edges of the shelf, make sure everything lines up nice and neat. Had to rotate the shelves a few times on my workbench in order to sand this down. But just like before, there was a lot of sanding. With sanding complete, I'm going to use some pre-stained wood conditioner and then just use a natural wood finish just to deepen the tone a little bit. So I've already applied the wood conditioner here, and now we're just going to go ahead and put the stain on. Again, this won't change the color all that much, but it will make it just a little bit darker. And one unintended side effect is that it actually brought out the difference in the two pieces of wood at the seam of the shelves. Before I had a really nice seam. In some places really hard to tell it was there at all. Once I put the stain on, you can actually see the change in the tone between the two pieces. But overall, I'm happy with the look here. It's going to match another pine shelf I've got in her room. Now the next day, the stain is dry, I'm going to come back and finish the shelves with spray lacquer. It's super easy to use, and then I also have this handy little tool that's going to allow me to more easily use an aerosol can. Saves your finger because now it's just a squeeze trigger basically. Ironically, the first can I use here, the metal pin was pushed down so far, I couldn't get it out, so I couldn't use the tool, so I had to use my finger anyway. But spray lacquer, very easy. Make sure you've got the right equipment on, make sure you're wearing the proper mask for it. But what's great about spray lacquer is there's no sanding in between coats. You just need to do several coats. So what I'm going to do here is actually 4 coats of spray lacquer. In other projects I've done 5 or 6, and sometimes it looks a little too plasticky, so I'm going to try and cut back a little bit and just do 4 coats. So this is the first coat here. Every 10-15 minutes I'm going to come back and put on another coat. Now the next day, I'm going to come back and just polish this down with some very fine steel wool. So if you just leave the spray lacquer as it is, even though it all dries and bonds to itself, it feels really rough if you don't smooth it down. So I have found success using steel wool, so I'm just going to come back with the steel wool and just very lightly brush down every surface. Now as I'm doing this, there are some mosquitoes. In fact, there's a spider on the camera there. So that's just some extra mosquito protection, the hazards of working outdoors. But just going to come back and I'm going to basically smooth down every surface on the shelves, and that's going to give me a really nice smooth final product. So here it is, stained, finished, ready to go, and we're going to bring this inside and see how this compares to the original idea. Here in the living room, again, I'm pretty happy with how this has turned out. It's going to fit perfectly into my daughter's room, and it's going to match some other furniture that she already has in there as well. And for the final product, we can see it here sitting in the corner of my daughter's room, just like we hoped it would. If you're still watching, thanks so much and hope you enjoyed this video.